I took a babysitting job, but their rules terrified me. It started with an innocent ad in the local newspaper. Babysitter needed for occasional evenings. Generous pay. Flexible hours. Call 555-1984. At 22, struggling to juggle college tuition and rent, I couldn't resist. I called the number that same afternoon, and a polite woman named Mrs. Hart answered. Her voice was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to what was to come. Mrs. Hart explained that they needed someone to watch their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, while they attended a charity gala. She assured me it was a simple job. Emily was quiet and well-behaved. What struck me as odd was her insistence that we meet in person immediately to discuss some important house rules. When I arrived at their home that evening, I was taken aback by its sheer size. The Victorian-style mansion loomed over the neighborhood like something out of a Gothic novel. Its sharp gables and intricate ironwork seemed to leer at me as I walked up the winding stone path. The house's windows were dark, save for the faint glow of a single porch light. Mrs. Hart greeted me at the door, her smile almost too wide. She was impeccably dressed, her auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her emerald green eyes were piercing. Mr. Hart appeared moments later, a tall, gaunt man with an unsettlingly quiet demeanor. Despite their smiles, there was something off about them, a stiffness, like they were rehearsing normalcy. They invited me inside and offered tea, which I politely declined. As we sat in the lavishly decorated living room, Mrs. Hart handed me a sheet of paper titled Babysitter Guidelines. It was thick, almost like a small booklet. I scanned the first few lines, my stomach knotting with unease. Number 1, always keep Emily in your sight. Number 2, do not enter the basement under any circumstances. Number 3, if the grandfather clock chimes at midnight, ensure Emily is in bed and the lights are off. Number 4, do not answer the door after 10 p.m., no matter who it is. Number 5, if Emily starts talking about the shadows, distract her immediately. Are these really necessary? I asked, half laughing to mask my growing discomfort. Mrs. Hart's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Yes, for Emily's safety and yours. Mr. Hart, who had been silent until now, added in a low, almost whispering voice, the rules aren't suggestions. Follow them, and you'll be fine. Despite my misgivings, I agreed to the job. The pay was too good to pass up, and I convinced myself their eccentricity was harmless. They gave me a quick tour of the house, pointing out Emily's room on the second floor, the kitchen, and the living room where I could relax after Emily went to bed. The basement door was conspicuously padlocked. Emily was as quiet and shy as her mother had described. She barely looked up from her drawing when I introduced myself, but she gave a small smile that melted a bit of my apprehension. She was a petite girl with dark curls and wide, curious eyes that seemed to hold a hint of sadness. The Harts left promptly at 7 p.m., promising to return by 1 a.m. As soon as the door closed, an eerie silence settled over the house, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The first couple of hours were uneventful. Emily and I played a board game, and I read her a bedtime story about friendly woodland creatures. By 9 p.m., she was tucked into bed, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. "Good night, Emily," I whispered, turning off the light. As I descended the staircase, I felt an inexplicable chill, as if the air had grown heavier. I brushed it off and settled on the couch with my textbook, determined to make the most of the quiet. At exactly 10 p.m., there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat. Remembering the rule, I stayed frozen. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I crept to the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness on the porch. My fingers itched to unlock the door, but the memory of Mr. Hart's warning stopped me. After a few agonizing minutes, the knocking ceased. Relieved, I returned to the couch, but the sense of unease lingered. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from upstairs. My blood turned cold. It wasn't heavy enough to be footsteps, but it was deliberate, like something dragging along the floor. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously climbed the stairs. As I reached the top, I noticed Emily's door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, I found her sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Emily," I whispered, stepping closer. She turned to me slowly, her voice trembling. "The shadows are watching." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I forced a smile, recalling the rule about distracting her. Let's check on Mr. Bunny, shall we? Maybe you want a bedtime snack." Emily nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. I led her downstairs, trying to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Once in the kitchen, I handed her a cookie and made small talk about her favorite cartoons. She seemed to relax, but I couldn't. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. At 11:50 p.m., the grandfather clock in the hallway began to whir softly, preparing for its midnight chime. I decided to put Emily back to bed, eager to adhere to the rules. As I tucked her in, she grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for such a small girl. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. My throat tightened. "Ooh, Emily." She pointed to the corner of the room, where shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, defying the soft glow of her nightlight. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "It's just your imagination," I assured her, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. The clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The sound echoed through the house, each strike reverberating in my chest. By the 12th chime, the entire house seemed to exhale, the oppressive tension lifting slightly. I turned off the light and closed Emily's door, leaving it open just a crack. As I descended the stairs, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, moving against the grain of the light. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My pulse raced as I retreated to the living room. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary babysitting job. Hours passed in the house, and the initial unease began to settle into something more sinister. The oppressive silence was now pierced by intermittent noises, faint whispers, the creak of floorboards, and the occasional soft thump that echoed from unseen corners of the house. Mia's nerves were on edge, but she reminded herself that old houses had quirks. When the clock struck midnight, Mia decided to check on Emily. She ascended the stairs carefully, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. She paused outside the child's door, the rules playing over in her mind. The 5th rule, do not wake Emily. A cold chill ran down her spine. Why such a strict rule about a child's sleep? She pressed her ear against the door, listening for any signs of distress. The sound of steady breathing assured her that Emily was asleep. Relieved, Mia turned to leave but froze when she saw something unusual. The hallway mirror reflected a figure standing behind her, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing. Spinning around, Mia found the space behind her empty. Heart pounding, she hurried downstairs, her eyes darting around the dimly lit house. The mirrors in the house suddenly felt like eyes watching her every move. Determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, Mia focused on keeping herself busy. She poured herself a glass of water, but as she lifted it to her lips, the reflection in the kitchen window caught her attention. The same shadowy figure stood outside in the garden, staring at her through the glass. The glass slipped from her hands, shattering on the counter. When she looked again, the figure was gone. Trembling, Mia backed away from the window and called Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. "Hello, Mrs. Caldwell. I think someone's outside the house," Mia said, trying to keep her voice steady. There was a pause before Mrs. Caldwell replied. "Mia, stay calm. Lock the doors and windows. Do not, I repeat, do not leave the house. We'll be home soon." Her tone was firm, but unnervingly cold. "But what about the figure I saw? Should I call the police?" Mia asked. "No police," Mrs. Caldwell said sharply. "Follow the rules, Mia. Everything will be fine." The call disconnected. Mia stared at her phone, the unease in her stomach now a solid weight. Why were they so adamant about no police? And what did they mean by follow the rules? Unable to shake her fear, Mia decided to double-check the locks on all doors and windows. As she moved through the house, she found herself drawn to the one door she hadn't entered. The room on the 2nd floor, directly across from Emily's. It was locked, but she remembered seeing a set of keys hanging near the kitchen. Against her better judgment, she retrieved them and returned to the door. Her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. The rules didn't explicitly forbid entering this room. After all, the lock clicked open, and Mia pushed the door ajar. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. The room was filled with antique furniture, old photographs, and dusty trinkets. At the center of the room stood a large wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate symbols that Mia couldn't recognize. One photograph on the dresser caught her eye. It was an old black and white image of a little girl, eerily similar to Emily. But the date on the photograph's frame was from over 70 years ago. How could that be? As Mia reached for the photograph, the chest creaked, opened slightly on its own. She stepped back, her breath hitching. Peering inside, she saw a collection of children's toys, porcelain dolls, wooden blocks, and faded teddy bears. Among them was a small, weathered book. Mia picked it up and flipped through its pages. They were filled with scrawled handwriting and crude drawings of the house, the mirrors, and Emily. One page sent chills down her spine. It read, "The child must sleep. The child must not wake. Do not break the rules, or they will come." Beneath the words was a drawing of dark, shadowy figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. A loud crash from Emily's room jolted Mia from her thoughts. She dropped the book and ran out of the forbidden room, slamming the door shut behind her. Heart racing, she darted into Emily's room and found the little girl sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "Emily, are you okay?" Mia asked, rushing to her side. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she pointed to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker, denser. Mia squinted, trying to see what Emily was pointing at, but there was nothing there. "It's them," Emily whispered finally, her voice trembling. "You woke them up." "Who?" "Emily, what are you talking about?" Mia asked, her voice rising in panic. "The Watchers," Emily said. "They don't like it when we break the rules." Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the shadows in the corner began to move, writhing and twisting like living creatures. Mia grabbed Emily and bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Downstairs, Mia held Emily close, her mind racing. She tried calling the Caldwells again, but her phone was dead. The house's landline didn't have a dial tone either. It was as if the house itself was cutting them off from the outside world. The shadows began to seep out from under the doors, crawling along the walls and ceiling. The mirrors reflected distorted, nightmarish versions of the house. In one mirror, Mia saw her own reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Emily clung to her, whispering, "They're angry. We need to fix it." "Fix what, Emily?" Mia asked desperately. "Put it back," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "The book, the chest, everything." Realizing she had no other choice, Mia ran back upstairs to the forbidden room. The shadows seemed to follow her, growing thicker and more aggressive. She burst into the room and grabbed the book from the floor. As she placed it back into the chest, the lid slammed shut on its own. For a moment, the house fell silent. But then, a low growl reverberated through the walls, and Mia knew it wasn't over. As she turned to leave the room, the shadows coalesced into tall, gaunt figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. They stood in the doorway, blocking her escape. Mia backed away, clutching the edge of the chest. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper. "You broke the rules." "I didn't mean to," Mia cried. "Please let us go." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her plea. Then it raised a long, bony finger and pointed at Mia. The air grew colder, and Mia felt an invisible force pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In a last-ditch effort, Mia screamed, "I'll follow the rules. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt Emily." The figures paused, their hollow eyes flickering with a faint light. Then, without a word, they dissolved into the shadows, leaving the room eerily quiet. Mia didn't wait to find out if they'd return. She grabbed Emily and ran downstairs. As she reached the front door, she found the Caldwells standing there, their faces pale but composed. "You broke the rules," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Before Mia could respond, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her and Emily inside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive silence of the house settled heavily on my shoulders. Each ticking second seemed to amplify the sense of dread that lingered in every corner. I checked the clock. 8 p.m. It was time to follow the last rule, the children's bedtime routine. I cautiously made my way up the staircase, its wooden boards groaning beneath my weight. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Framed family portraits lined the walls, but something about them was unsettling. In each photo, the children looked slightly off, their smiles too wide, their eyes too vacant, as if they were forced to pose against their will. I paused outside the children's room and took a deep breath before opening the door. Inside, the room was eerily pristine, with two identical beds neatly made with hospital corner precision. The twins sat on their beds, their pale faces illuminated by the cold glow of a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. They looked up at me in unison, their expressions void of emotion. "Time for bed, Alex and Lily," I said, forcing a smile to mask my unease. "Are you going to tell us a story?" Lily asked, her voice monotone yet insistent. Her piercing gaze made it impossible to look away. I nodded hesitantly. "Sure. What kind of story would you like?" Alex spoke next, his voice an echo of his sister's. "Tell us a story about the house." "The house?" My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The house where the babysitters don't listen to the rules," Lily replied, her lips curling into a faint smile. A chill ran down my spine, but I composed myself and began weaving a simple story to appease them. As I spoke, their expressions remained unnervingly still, their eyes fixed on me as if they were studying my every word. When I finished, Alex spoke again. "You forgot to check the closet." "Excuse me," I stammered. Lily nodded solemnly. "It's part of the rules. You have to check the closet before we can sleep." I hesitated. There was no mention of a closet in the instructions, but their insistence was unnerving, and I didn't want to upset them. With a heavy heart, I approached the closet. Its old wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing a dark void within. I reached out and slowly pulled it open, the hinges creaking like a scream. The light from the room barely penetrated the darkness, and I strained to see inside. The closet was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned back to the children, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. My breath hitched as I whipped my head around, but the closet was still empty. Lily giggled softly. "You didn't look long enough." "What?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "You have to really look," Alex added, his tone eerily calm. Against my better judgment, I leaned into the closet, squinting into the darkness. A faint, rhythmic sound reached my ears, a low, guttural breathing. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, a cold hand shot out of the shadows, gripping my wrist with inhuman strength. I screamed and yanked my arm back, slamming the closet door shut. The children's laughter filled the room, a sound far too sinister for their young faces. "That's enough," I said, my voice shaking. "It's time for bed." To my surprise, they complied without protest, lying down and pulling the covers up to their chins. Their eyes remained open, staring at me until I turned off the light and closed the door behind me. As I stood in the hallway, my heart pounded in my chest. What had just happened? I retreated to the living room, desperate to collect my thoughts. The events of the night had shaken me to my core, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this house. I reached for my phone to call the parents, but the screen displayed no signal. Of course, just my luck. I contemplated leaving, but the thought of abandoning the children didn't sit right with me, no matter how unsettling they were. As I sat on the couch, my gaze wandered to the basement door. Something about it drew me in, an almost magnetic pull. I remembered the final rule: do not enter the basement under any circumstances. But what if the answers I sought were down there? My rational mind screamed at me to stay away, but curiosity gnawed at me like a relentless itch. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I approached the basement door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob, the old wood groaning in protest. The door swung open, revealing a steep staircase that disappeared into pitch-black darkness. I took a tentative step down, the air growing colder with each descent. The faint smell of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils, making me gag. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebs and crumbling walls. Halfway down, I froze. A low, guttural growl echoed from below, sending a wave of terror through me. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I took another step, and my flashlight flickered before plunging me into complete darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against my palm in desperation. When the light returned, I wished it hadn't. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was a figure cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing an unnatural shade of red. It tilted its head, studying me with an almost animalistic curiosity. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the entire house. I leaned against it, gasping for air, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Back in the living room, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Was it a trick of the light? My imagination running wild? But deep down, I knew the truth. This house harbored something evil, something beyond my comprehension. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft tapping sound. I turned toward the source, my blood running cold. The sound was coming from the front window. Slowly, I approached and peered through the curtains. Outside, standing under the pale light of the street lamp, was the figure from the basement. Its glowing red eyes bored into me, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. In its hand, it held a piece of paper, pressing it against the glass for me to see. Scrawled in jagged letters were the words, "You broke the rules." The air in the house felt heavier than before, as though the walls were whispering secrets too dark for words. Sarah clutched the crimson diary tightly in her trembling hands, its leather cover unnaturally warm to the touch. She tried to shake off the unease crawling under her skin as she flipped it open to the first page. Rules of the House was written in a delicate, swirling script that sent chills down her spine. Beneath it, the ink seemed to shimmer with an unnatural hue, almost as if it were alive. The first few entries were mundane: bedtime schedules, meal preferences, and general housekeeping tips. But as she turned the pages, the instructions grew increasingly bizarre. Do not look into mirrors after sunset. Never enter the basement, no matter what you hear. If you hear someone knocking after midnight, do not open the door. Sarah's hands grew clammy as she read further. These weren't just house rules. They were warnings, etched with the desperation of someone who had learned them the hard way. Her attention was suddenly ripped away by a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. It was coming from upstairs. Heart pounding, Sarah carefully placed the diary on the coffee table. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to activate the flashlight. The soft glow illuminated her path as she tiptoed up the stairs, each creak beneath her feet sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the door to the children's bedroom. Swallowing her fear, Sarah hesitated before reaching for the doorknob. She pushed it open cautiously and found Emma and Max sitting upright in their beds. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, while Max pointed toward the window. "It's outside," he whispered. "It wants to come in." Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the window. For a moment, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, a shadow moved, a face pressed against the glass, its features distorted as though it were underwater. The thing's eyes were wide and unblinking, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Sarah gasped and stumbled backward, nearly dropping her phone. The face disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the faint trace of foggy breath on the window pane. "Did you see it?" Emma's voice was barely audible. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She rushed to the window and pulled the curtains shut, her hands shaking. Turning to the children, she forced a calm tone into her voice. "It's gone now. Stay here and don't move. I'll be right back." Descending the stairs, Sarah's mind raced. The diary, it had to hold answers. She needed to know what she was dealing with. Picking it up, she flipped to the middle, where the handwriting had grown more frantic. "The shadow knows. It always knows. Do not let it in. They told us we could never leave, that the house belonged to it. The children, they are the key. It wants them." Her breath caught in her throat. The children weren't just in danger. They were the target. A sudden crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Sarah froze, the diary slipping from her grasp. The sound of something dragging across the floor sent a chill down her spine. She crept toward the kitchen, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The room was a mess. The glass door of the cabinet was shattered, shards scattered across the floor. But what drew her attention was the trail of dark, viscous liquid leading toward the basement door. The metallic scent in the air made her stomach turn. The basement. The one place she wasn't supposed to go. Sarah hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The door had been left ajar, and the trail of liquid disappeared into the inky darkness below. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that if she didn't face whatever was down there, it would come for the children next. Taking a deep breath, she descended the creaking steps. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth mingled with the metallic tang. Her flashlight beam barely pierced the suffocating darkness, revealing a room cluttered with old furniture and forgotten belongings. Then she saw it. A figure stood in the far corner, its back turned to her. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. The shadow-like form seemed to ripple, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. The figure turned slowly, revealing hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, and when it spoke, its voice was a guttural rasp that echoed in her mind. "You broke the rules." The figure lunged toward her with inhuman speed, its shadowy form stretching and twisting unnaturally. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, her flashlight tumbling from her hands and plunging the room into near-total darkness. She scrambled to her feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. The house seemed alive now, its walls groaning and shifting as though reacting to her terror. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from below, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah ran to the children's room, throwing the door open. Emma and Max were huddled together, their faces streaked with tears. "We have to go," she said urgently. "Now." She grabbed their hands and led them toward the front door, but as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The shadow was everywhere now, seeping through the cracks in the walls, coalescing into a dark mass that blocked their escape. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, surrounding them. "The house is mine, and so are you." Desperation clawed at Sarah's mind, but then she remembered the diary. There had to be something in it, some way to fight back. She thrust the children behind her and raced to the living room, snatching the book from the floor. Flipping through the pages, she found the final entry. "The only way to break the curse is to sever its hold. The house must be destroyed." Her eyes darted to the fireplace, where an old canister of kerosene sat beside the woodpile. It wasn't much, but might be enough. Gathering her courage, she grabbed the canister and splashed the liquid across the walls and floor, the acrid smell stinging her nose. "Stay close to me," she told the children. With trembling hands, she struck a match. The flames roared to life, consuming the room in an instant. The shadow shrieked, its form writhing and twisting as the fire engulfed it. Sarah grabbed the children and kicked open a window, helping them climb out before following them into the cold night air. They watched from a safe distance as the house burned, its walls collapsing in on themselves. The shadow's screams faded into the crackling of the fire, and then there was silence. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left of the house but smoldering rubble. Sarah held Emma and Max close, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Who had written the diary? What was the shadow, and why had it targeted the house? But one thing was certain, they were free, or so she thought. As she turned to lead the children away, Emma tugged on her sleeve. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." Sarah followed Emma's gaze. In the ashes of the house, a faint, glowing smile lingered in the darkness. The night was an amalgamation of distorted sounds and flashes of haunting imagery. The flickering lights cast grotesque shadows on the walls, and the air felt heavy with a palpable, malevolent energy. My mind raced with questions as I clutched the crimson diary tightly, its pages still warm from where my fingers had turned them. The truth was within my grasp, but with it came a surge of dread, so profound it nearly paralyzed me. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate, their cadence like a countdown. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the diary like a talisman. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker were approaching, their silhouettes growing larger as they neared. Their features were obscured by the dim light, but their presence radiated an unnatural menace. I couldn't stay there. Summoning every ounce of courage, I darted into the nursery, the one place that had been relatively untouched by the horrors of the night. The Whitakers' footsteps quickened behind me, accompanied by a guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I turned to face the room. The nursery's pastel walls and soft toys felt like a cruel mockery of innocence. The crib stood in the center, eerily pristine despite everything else in the house being in disarray. I knew the answers lay within the diary, but I had to act quickly. My hands trembled as I flipped to the final entries, desperate to uncover the truth. June 17th. Tonight, we performed the ritual. The house groaned under the weight of the incantation, and the child's cries grew louder with each passing moment. The elders assured us this was the way to secure eternal life, to bind our souls to this plane. But something went wrong. The entity we summoned was not what we expected. It is angry, vengeful, and it feeds on fear. June 18th. The child's body was consumed by the entity, leaving behind only its echo. The entity now resides in the nursery, tied to the crib. We tried to reverse the ritual, but it was too late. It demands sacrifice. Regular offerings keep it dormant, but any deviation results in chaos. We've tried to leave, but the house won't let us go. It's as much our prison as it is its lair. My stomach turned as the truth sank in. The Whitakers had sacrificed their own child to summon some sort of malevolent force, and now they were bound to this house. Enslaved by the entity they had unleashed. The rules they had given me weren't just arbitrary. They were desperate measures to appease the creature. But why had they hired me? What role did I play in this twisted game? The doorknob rattled violently, snapping me out of my thoughts. The Whitakers were trying to break in. Claire, Mrs. Whitaker's voice called, unnervingly calm despite the situation. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Open the door, and we can explain. Stay away from me. I screamed, my voice cracking. I glanced around the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a silver letter opener on the changing table. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The door frame splintered as Mr. Whitaker threw his weight against it. You have to follow the rules, Claire, he growled. If you don't, it'll take you instead. Instead of answering, I turned my attention back to the diary. There had to be a way to stop this. The last entry provided a glimmer of hope. June 19th. The only way to banish the entity is to destroy the crib. It's the anchor that binds it to this world. But doing so will release all its fury. It will fight back with everything it has. Only the purest heart can withstand its wrath. I looked at the crib, my resolve hardening. If destroying it was the only way to end this nightmare, then so be it. I grabbed the letter opener and approached the crib. As I raised the blade, the room plunged into darkness, and an ear-piercing wail filled the air. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature plummeted. A shadowy figure materialized above the crib, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth opened in a soundless scream. The entity lashed out, its tendrils wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me away from the crib. The letter opener clattered to the floor as I struggled against its grip. You can't stop it, Mr. Whitaker shouted as he burst into the room, his face twisted with fear. It'll kill you. Then so be it. I shouted back, summoning every ounce of courage. With a burst of adrenaline, I wrenched myself free and dove for the letter opener. The entity roared, its tendrils flailing wildly as I plunged the blade into the crib's wooden frame. The room erupted in chaos. The walls cracked and crumbled, the floor buckled, and the air was filled with an unholy scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The entity's form dissolved into a blinding light, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the nursery was gone. I was lying on the cold, damp ground outside the house, the diary still clutched in my hand. The Whitakers were nowhere to be seen, and the house stood eerily silent, its windows dark and lifeless. A sense of peace washed over me, but it was tinged with sorrow. The Whitakers had paid the ultimate price for their hubris, and the child's spirit was finally free. As I stood and began walking away, The diary crumbled to ash in my hands, carried away by the wind. I never took another babysitting job after that. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of that unholy scream ringing in my ears. But deep down, I know I did the right thing. The entity was gone, and its reign of terror had ended. Or so I hoped.